We're talking with Dan Holden, who's director of ACERT for Arbor Networks. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Yeah, I should say welcome back and back and back.
It's like the Rocky movies.
That's right. Once again, we get to talk about some of the things we've experienced in the last year and predict what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
And obviously, you've got the unique perspective of heading up ACERT for Arbor Networks, so you see a lot that most of us don't see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before we dig in, what's the tooling behind what you get to see?
We have a monitoring system worldwide via the world's ISPs that give us an amazing visibility into overall internet health, DDoS attacks, and we also do botnet monitoring, really focused on campaigns. So DDoS attacks, financial fraud, retail point-of-sale type of activity, and geopolitical type campaigns, and of course, everyone's favorite APT.
Yep.
So we have a bit of a different methodology at Arbor. We really try and focus again on those campaigns, and we do it more from a botnet point of view than anything else, for a couple different reasons. One, we're again very focused on the campaign aspect. The type of malware that has someone on the other end of it, someone that cares, someone that wants something out of this, besides just credit card numbers. Except for the point-of-sale stuff, obviously.
Right, yeah.
But your credit card number.
Yeah.
So not interested
that,
after, we do the typical kind of spyware sort of thing, but, that's table stakes. So try and focus in on that area, and again, from a botnet point of view, allowing us to see the malware as it's changing from the command and control, and, when it's issued new commands or what it's doing. Really focused on what the full capability of the malware is, not just, the one sample that might have hit you.
So let's talk about the big ones. Let's talk about Sony first, because I'm certainly seeing a reaction. It's like, what does it take? Obviously, people aren't watching our talks.
That's the question, isn't it? Will 2014 actually be as impactful as we'd like it to be?
Yeah, exactly. I do talk to senior executives who are definitely concerned when they see the types of damage that somebody could do if they really, really just wanted to do harm, which is apparently what happened at Sony. So terabytes of data leaked, machines destroyed, and it was a big part of 60 Minutes, and they were interviewing Sony when they're still involved in a cleanup effort. Yeah,
it was certainly a big one. It's also, maybe it's educational for everyone, because everyone has been now, so focused on China and APT style of attacks now for so many years. But you've got so many other kinds of actors out there, whether it's hacktivism, or you've got the lizard squads, or the Syrian electronic armies, or plenty of other countries that have built out, really good capability. And it just goes to show, if someone cares enough, anything's possible. So I think, with Anonymous, right, most people just worry about DDoS and SQL injection, which is bad enough. But you really upset someone, and they can come after you, whether that's just an individual or a particular group or nation state. And that one was a very good example of when someone cares, how far they can go and how damaging it can be, and continues to be damaging. Now the emails have all been posted on WikiLeaks. So now everyone gets some amazing visibility into a place they wouldn't ever, otherwise.
Yeah. And it tells us a little something about the investigative capabilities of journalists who could have had all of these stories months ago, because all that data was there, but they waited for WikiLeaks to build a tool to help make it easy to mine it.
Well, it's amazing what people will say over email as well, isn't it? So it
really is.
It is a very good reminder, especially as a security practitioner. We're all getting older now, but you have to you got to remind yourself that paranoia was a good thing, and that I need to keep that. And that's what makes you any good at security at all, is that natural paranoia that I think we all brought into the industry initially, and many have forgotten along the way.
And then there's limits too, because we've been lulled into the sense that we can do risk management, and so even at Sony, they may have had a risk management program. Judging by leaked PwC audit reports, they weren't very far along. But during a risk management process, where would you have said, hey, what if North Korea doesn't like the fact that we're putting together a movie about North Korea's leader, and what could that mean to us? That's the thing. Just as you don't know which one of your critical assets that an attacker might actually be interested in, because you might be RSA security, and they need the seeds for your secure ID tokens to get into Lockheed, and you don't know that. You don't ever.
Well, and that's
think of
I
that.
think the issue here is you're not. Maybe you're thinking about risk assessment purely from how many assets do we have, or where
Right.
is our data at? But we see this all the time with sporting events. You know, the Olympics, World Cup, the F1 race, especially when it's in Bahrain. Anytime someone is upset at you, you know, or anytime when there's one of these events, there's a reason for someone to be upset at you for whatever reason that might be. And people think about their risk, but so much of your risk assessment is also these third parties. And so people don't think about, oh, well, I sponsored that sporting event. And so is this, right? So, you know, they can go after the sponsors, and they do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same issue here with Sony, right? They didn't think that was their risk, right? They were thinking probably, you know, intellectual property theft, or the typical kind of issues that most of these environments have, or one might assume they might have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. They probably weren't thinking about, you know, a movie about North Korea.
Yep. Yeah.
Especially given the fact that it's a comedy.
Yeah, exactly. And one that most people don't think is very good either.
I personally, I enjoyed it a lot.
I did too.
But it's my kind of movie.
Yeah.
The lower the humor, probably, the better the movie for me. So one of my all-time favorite movies is still Spaceballs, if that says anything.
That says a lot. Thank you very much. So let's move to your wheelhouse. So they're calling it the Great Chinese Cannon, but the DDoS attacks against GitHub. Walk us through, you know, what we saw there this year.
Well, I'll just comment on DDoS in general, whether it's GitHub or anyone else. The last 2 years especially have shown attacks have kind of moved back away from the application, and now to very large attacks and amplification reflection attacks that are not difficult to pull off and produce massive amounts of traffic. You know, so now we see. I mean, there was a 300 gig attack, you know, just a couple weeks ago, and nobody blinked an eye. You know, whereas not long ago that was the biggest attack on the internet ever.
Yeah,
right. And
I remember when 20 gigs made headlines.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, when Spamhaus, the attack against Spamhaus hit, right, that was, everybody was blown away that the attack could be so big. You know, now we see 400 and over 400 fairly, you know, regularly, and it's just something that now happens on the internet. And the lists are public, and it's, you know, it's like the old days in the 90s with Smurf, right? You know, everybody knows where the amplifiers are, both the defenders and the attackers. And so it's just a question of how long will it take for these things to clean up, and it will take some time, just as Smurf did. But in the meantime, those sizable attacks are not that difficult to pull off, and Lizard Squad proved the same thing against both Sony and Microsoft during Christmas, and ruined a lot of holiday fun with people in their new game consoles. So, you know, again, probably something they weren't expecting, right? Who's going to be a Grinch on Christmas and ruin gaming for kids?
Right.
But you know,
There they are. So walk us through the GitHub attack, because it was interesting from a couple different aspects.
Well, the big thing you have to ask yourself is, why does anybody want to go after GitHub? You know, it's a fairly popular tool and site, and you know, it's why would someone go after it? But it's one of those things where if you deny service to GitHub, it's very impactful to a lot of different people. And so, you know, it's one of those few attacks, I think, especially with DDoS, where you're actually impacting a large group of people for completely different reasons. And I think that's kind of what makes it so interesting, because normally if you go after a particular site, right, if you go after a bank, let's say, right, you're only messing with their customers. Well, GitHub's customers are very broad in nature, and maybe it wasn't that important for some folks, but it was very important for others that rely on GitHub as a service. So I think that one's actually a little bit different, because the measure of that impact would not be all that easy compared to if a bank was down, or when you
Right.
can measure things in revenue, or you can measure things in brand damage or something like that.
I'm sure there's somebody that just couldn't get their code uploaded that day and put them back a week in their development process.
Well, I mean, or something was being hosted that they didn't like. I mean, that happens all the time. You say something, you post something, right? And I mean, that's the interesting thing about DDoS, and it's now used as such a voice of dissension because it's not hard, right? And so you might ask, well, why would they do it? Well, because it's not hard.
Right. Yep.
Because I can,
Yep.
right? And so the because I can is actually possible because it's just not that difficult to pull off.
Yeah, are we getting better at defending against DDoS?
Absolutely, and that's actually the interesting thing about DDoS versus other security problems, is it's a totally defendable attack. It's a totally tractable problem. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's solvable and you can get rid of it. That's not the case, but you can absolutely defend against it. It's not as difficult as having a good password, the simple things. But there are so many other security risks that are very difficult, just because there can be so much. There's really no reason that a service that is quite popular, quite used, or is your revenue generation machine should be impacted by DDoS, because they are defendable. Now, not to say that it's cheap or easy. It's not that either. But from a pure engineering technology standpoint, it is a tractable problem.
Throughout the history of security, as long as we've been involved, it's been possible to, and we've seen it happen over and over, somebody says, hey, this is possible. We could take over a car or something like that.
Right, yeah.
We could do a DDoS attack using, reflection from DNS results. And then eventually there's tests out there, and it happens, and all of a sudden it's a big thing, and it's in the newspapers.
Right.
Everybody talks about it. One of those things is attacks against critical infrastructure. We've got government officials talking about cyber Pearl Harbors, and while they're talking about all that, so it's an acknowledgement that these systems are vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that's a given. In 2014, we saw two families of malware that were essentially doing reconnaissance on U.S. infrastructure. We've seen a report from the German cyber something who said a steel foundry was destroyed via targeted cyber attack.
Which was a bigger deal than I think most people.
Yeah,
because again, it was
the first.
After Stuxnet.
Yep.
Right. That was the first. The big proven that it was connected to something.
Right. And we've got some connection, anyways, attribution between some of the malware that's being used to sniff out our networks as being attributable to Russian hackers. Not necessarily Russia, but Russian hackers.
Yeah.
So is 2015 the year that we actually experienced power outages? And
Well, it's funny, because the power went out at the White House a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
That's a great question. So I'll tell you from a nation state versus nation state standpoint, right? I think everybody is totally capable of doing it.
Sure.
Our infrastructure here in the States is quite old, compared to a lot of other countries. Part of that just because it was done so long ago. Part of that because we're a very large country. It's there's tons of scans that will point out SCADA systems connected to the internet, even though everybody preaches air gap and all of that. So
all you have to do is look at the Shodan maps, and you just find them.
Yeah, right. So we know it's not hard. I think from a nation-state standpoint, it's a line nobody wants to cross. So I don't see it happening there, unless it is a nation with, less to lose.
Right.
And that's where your Irans and your North Koreas can get
Syria.
scary, right? Yeah, Syria,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's only a few countries in that possible position. But do you really want to upset and anger the U.S., when we've clearly said, we'll come drop bombs on you if you mess with such things? So I think everyone understands that risk. I think the real possibility is cyber terrorism.
Right.
If you've got, look at France, the whole country was DDoSed.
Yeah.
That's pretty impactful and something I'm sure no one was expecting. And so if you have a terrorist organization that would want to do something like this, I think that's probably your real risk, very real risk. I mean, you could almost say maybe surprised that it hasn't already happened. And maybe it's just because, it's not that it's that difficult to find these things, but, to pull something off that was targeted at a specific, place or entity that you wanted to go after, it's not as well understood, perhaps, right? It's not as simple as just writing a piece of malware or launching a DDoS attack. You really have to learn these systems, and it's not like you can buy one on eBay, right? And reverse engineer, a SCADA system, and of course that's why we all knew Stuxnet was so impressive and done by someone that had access to those kinds of systems, right? So it's more complex, but I mean, I hate to say that, but yeah, it almost wouldn't surprise me just because we know the risk is there.
Yep. So you paint the scenario that it's happened. How do we react? Obviously, Congress will immediately pass some sort of post-Katrina-like law of some sort. What form will it take, I wonder?
Well, that's the problem, because these kinds of systems are the opposite of IT systems, right? I mean, in IT systems, we generally look at confidentiality and integrity over availability in many cases. And in these systems, it's quite the opposite. Availability is everything, right? Because we can't do any of this without power. You got to have water. And so, retrofitting all these things with some magical solution is really not an easy or maybe even possible, sort of thing to do. So, the answer will have to be that any future systems would be built, I think, with other security measures, or there would be some best practices put together, which there are, but things enforced, I think, probably at a best practice level, where do this, don't do that. So a heavily enforced kind of PCI type situation, and they've got NERC SIP and those things kind of exist, but we know things aren't as good as they could or should be. But I think it would probably be something forced towards these large vendors that produce these systems. But again, retrofitting things that are so old and I personally don't know how you pull that off.
Well, I'm just hoping that the first attributable cyber attack against critical infrastructure is small, so damage is limited. We can start the reaction process without the draconian immediate $1 trillion measures.
Well, it's interesting because we've had these attacks already, and it was after systems that were not critical at that nature, right? So a few years ago, 2 years or whatever it was, you had the U.S. banks being attacked for a full year, and being DDoSed, and there were U.S. politicians pointing the finger at Iran. And so if you take that as the answer, right, and it was Iran, and it's so difficult to say. But let's say it was, they didn't choose to go after any of that. Again, I don't think anyone wants to cross that line, so instead they went after the banks. And then the banks and the ISPs, everybody figures out, oh wow, that is critical infrastructure. It's extended critical infrastructure. Because if you mess with the economy or the communications of a country, that's almost as damaging as messing with the power or water, right? So you're messing with the country health rather than the people health. And so we've seen that, I mean, to keep DDoS attacks going for a full year, that really takes someone that cares about what they're doing. Which, can lead you towards the path of a nation state being behind it. But, I think that's probably would be your more typical type of attack. And again, maybe because it's more well understood, and again, I would say probably because the risk is lower. You go cutting off our power, and I would imagine the president's going to be on TV, and it's going to be bad for whoever did it.
But that'll raise the issue of the attribution issue. So, but just as with a terrorist attack, so if somebody claims credit, you usually give them credit.
Certainly. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, look at what happened with the Sony attack. And the FBI tells us that it was, North Korea, and so many people really question that. So it is a fascinating problem because it's all done so publicly, right? This is not like top secret stuff that none of us know about.
Right.
You know, I'm sure there are top secret things
that we don't know about.
But at the same time, right, well, and that was kind of the industry's point to the FBI. Okay, well, if you're so sure, release it to us so we can double check your homework.
Yeah.
Which, you know, there are reasons for not doing so, I guess.
Yeah.
And
well, if you think about it, if you have the global surveillance network that apparently the NSA and GCHQ have, in other words, they're tapping into fiber or undersea cables. If they're collecting everything, then you'd be pretty good at attribution.
Well, and the other thing I like to point out to people is, yes, we as the industry can do, digital attribution.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, what the government has that we don't is human attribution, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is still a world of spies.
Yeah.
And, there are people on the street, and hopefully your intel is better than ours,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the assumption that their intel is better. But we are a very paranoid industry,
Mm-hmm.
and an industry comprised of mainly engineers that like to be sure about things.
Mm-hmm.
So it puts these governments in kind of a prickly position.
Yeah.
And especially given the fact that so many of the companies in this industry are truly global. And even if they are U.S. based, their revenue is worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
They view things as worldwide. So it's become a very complex world we live in, where so much of what occurs geopolitically is now reflected in our digital lives.
Yep. Yep.
Something I think a lot of people probably wouldn't have predicted years ago, or maybe it's happened sooner or larger or in different ways than we would have predicted.
Right. So putting on the binoculars now, looking forward, what could possibly happen in the coming year other than the ICS stuff?
Well, I think the interesting thing, I think it was Dave Eitel that said the internet's the new ocean, and along with that, are these countries building navies.
Mm-hmm.
And post-Snowden NSA world, you see every single country building out that capability if they didn't already have it or they're beefing it up.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's, I think, the obvious to be expected. The unknown there is what all that means for us as just, citizens of this country and citizens of the world. As you travel, as you communicate, as we do business now, things are actually getting, potentially harder than they were.
Yeah,
because
it's friction.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Friction is, I think, a very good word to apply to this.
Mm-hmm.
So all right. Well, we all want the world to be a safe place where we can carry on, a nice capitalistic environment where we can all trade. But yeah, these countries are now perhaps so paranoid, not even of just each other, but their own citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, Russia is more than likely, wanting to spy on themselves just as much as they are anyone else.
Sure.
Right? To keep things, controlled. And certainly that's how a lot of countries approach it. So I think that's, personally, I think that's one of the things that kind of scares me and is the, remains to be seen, something like the Snowden event, how much more of that sort of scenario do we learn, and do we learn about other parts of the world?
Right.
And how it might affect us,
Yep.
with other parts of the world, whether that's trade or whether that's just you being a tourist.
Yeah. One of the interesting things and gratifying things is that the security industry and the technology industry is responding. So, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft encrypting everything.
Mm-hmm.
The move to more and more encrypted websites to reduce that ability to surveil.
Yeah, well, and I'm perhaps weird in this industry. I don't necessarily believe that encryption is the solution to every problem. It ruins your visibility,
Right.
into
It
so many
really
things.
hurts your security
Everyone is, encryption's the answer. Okay, and now we have no visibility into anything.
Right.
And you know what? Especially from an attacker standpoint, attackers don't care if you've encrypted it.
Yeah.
There are so many angles to the data.
Yeah.
Just take the more obvious angles. The likelihood of an attacker going after, crypto is so low because crypto is so good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much effect it really has on the attack surface.
Mm-hmm.
It might make us feel better, but that's kind of the way I look at crypto at this point. Is it's almost more of a catharsis than a solution.
Mm.
And again, I'm sure there are plenty of people that might disagree with that, but that's kind of the way I view it, because everything's encrypted, and has anything gotten better?
Mm-hmm. And back in our innocent days, we used to assume that, for somebody to actually intercept our traffic, because there's very few breaches that, other than things that the NSA has done, that involve intercepting the traffic itself, right?
Yeah.
So we've been fine without encryption all this time. So it's almost like that link encryption is purely something to stop the NSA from gathering that information.
Yeah, no, right. I think the NSA certainly cares more about it than any attacker does.
Yeah. And then after you encrypt, the NSA is like, their entire history has been stealing keys. So that's all they're going to go after anyway. So they'll have the keys when they need them, as any other attacker will. So.
It's not that it's bad. It's just, for me, a questionable ROI, I guess.
Right. Well, I'm not quite sure. We've got a lot to look forward to this year, other than more bad news, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to once again address the issues with you, Dan.
Always fun. I appreciate it.
Yep.